Chapter 18, guys, really, none of this stuff is new. Okay, all this stuff we've already done. We talked about biodiversity earlier this year when we did that one project over, remember this? Hotspots. Remember we did hotspots? That was the whole point to that, so that you cover this chapter with the project. So that's kind of nice. So what's the point of a hotspot? Anybody remember what the point of like identifying hotspots in the world?
Preserve them.
Preserve them? Yeah. So why we want to preserve a hotspot versus just like, you know, middle of the desert with nothing in it?
Because of the most common. Yeah.
It's a high value target, right? What if I have one rare flower in Antarctica? I mean, you should preserve that, right? That's a rare species. It might be endangered or threatened. How many of those could there possibly be in the entire world? Yet, if you have a really small place like Madagascar, right, with like 7,500 rare species, why can't we just go, well, let's protect both? Why can't we just protect both? What would be a limiting factor for us to be able to do that? Resources and money, right? So unfortunately, all of our priorities are not into ecological preservation, right? So we have to make decisions. We've got to make tough decisions. And the whole point of that hotspot activity was that you see that hotspots have a lot of biodiversity in a very small area. And so you get the biggest bang for your buck if you're going to spend money on that. All right, so right now, people say we're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction. And we know that because there is a gigantic decline in genetic diversity. Gigantic decline in genetic diversity. In fact, if you look at the patterns of what's been happening recently in human history, we've lost almost 1,000 times more species in the last 50 years than any other time in human history. That's crazy, right? 1,000 times more. That includes the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We were like making factories, clear-cutting forests so we can put human civilizations. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to look at the decline in genetic diversity of wild species, domesticated species. We're going to look at patterns that relate to that, right? And in the coming days, in the next lecture, we'll look at reasons why. We'll look at all the different reasons why, human activities. All right. So we experience currently about 50,000 species extinctions per year. And I said already that that's about 1,000 times higher in the past 50 years than any other time in human history. So the things that humans do, we interact with the environment, they have accelerated. That's what that means. They've accelerated. And why might things that humans do have accelerated in the past 50 years? What's so different about our lives in the last 50 years than 100 years? What's different? A lot greater fossil fuel use. What else? Yeah. Increase in population, human population. That is the #1 factor. And as human population increases, and we don't kill ourselves, what ends up happening invariably to our society? What happens to our society over time if we survive long enough? It gets better. We make more things, right? So if our standard of living goes up, what happens to our level of consumption? It goes way up, right? Okay, so remember that the impact equation, that IPAT equation from way back in the day. I equals P-A-T. IPAT, impact, is your population size times your affluency, times the amount of time that you exist, right? All this stuff should be kind of familiar, but that's one of the equations you need to remember, okay? You're not going to calculate anything with it, but it's just so you can kind of make relationships, okay? It's important to note, guys, that 99% of everything that has ever lived on Earth is dead. Don't take credit for that. Don't feel proud of yourself. You didn't do that, okay? We didn't do all of that, okay? A lot of that had to do with stuff that happened way before us. But in the last 50 years, we are on cataclysmic levels of biodiversity decline. We are rivaling the meteor impact of 65 million years ago. Okay? That is the order of destruction that human beings are having on the planet right now. So why do we care? And why do we care? Is it just like a hippie thing? Like we like all the animals. I like the Panda Express, the red panda, the dumb panda. You guys seen that dumb panda video where the pandas are like just sitting down and they do like cartwheels everywhere? And they fall out of trees and stuff. They sit on each other. Why do I care about those things? Those things are dumb. They don't even reproduce on their own. Why do I care? Well, here's why you care. You have better genetic diversity of species if you have a wide range of animals. We did this earlier in the year with Shannon's index. We did the thing with the jelly beans. Remember the jelly beans? Yeah. So the more evenness you have, the higher number of species you have, the more resilient the entire population is going to be. Okay. So if you don't have genetic variation, you end up with this idea of inbreeding depression right here. So inbreeding depression is an old word. So what happens if you inbreed? You don't get to mix genetic material, which means your kids and your kids' kids are going to have almost the same DNA as you. Why is that a bad thing for adaptation? Why is that a bad thing to have the same DNA year after year after year?
Because if one thing kills the parents, it'll kill all the children.
Yeah, so if there's some sort of abiotic factor or biotic factor that comes in and messes up a generation, the chances of the future generations surviving that are going to be very, very low. Okay? So you want to be able to adapt to new changes. Okay? What about what happens when just inbreeding happens in general? What is the acute effects of inbreeding? Not just like what will happen in the long term. Yeah, you get disadvantageous mutations, right? You get these genetic defects. So you have to vary your DNA as much as possible. Okay, so having high genetic diversity improves the probability of surviving future changes in the environment. Is what we talked about. All right. So livestock. What are the types of livestock that human beings depend on? Cows and chickens, horses. What else? Any other ones you guys can think of? Sheep. Yeah. So those things right there. In nature, we would have survival of the fittest, which just means their ability to reproduce, right? And that would be a series of selections that are natural, right? The people with the lucky genes that are good for the environment they're in would survive, and they would pass on their genes, right? But what do human beings do? Do we affect like the genetic history of species when we domesticate them? Yes, no? Yes. Do we typically pick species for their ability to survive in a range of climates and conditions? No, not typically, right? In the past we did because we had to, right? If I lived in the middle of the desert and I had a horse that had to drink like 45 gallons of water a day, that horse wouldn't make it. So I'd need something that was able to store water. Maybe can get by with a little bit less. So I would artificially select for those traits, right? If I needed an animal that could eat cactus, right, I wouldn't want to have one that could only eat really soft clover beds, right? It doesn't make any sense. But nowadays we don't pick animals for their resilience, right? What do we pick animals for when we're doing agricultural corporate agriculture? What do we pick animals for? How much they can produce, right? Their meat, the amount of meat. My brother is a plant manager for Tyson Chicken, but he did his studies in A&M for meat sciences, and he knows all about the different types of cows that we have and everything. And he said, really, really amazing fact, in the last 20 years or so, the average T-bone steak size has gone from about 11 inches in diameter to like 17, 18 inches in diameter, right? And that's from just artificial selection. That's artificial selection, right? So that's good if you need to produce and feed a lot of people, right? If you need to produce a GMO, like a lot of our corn is genetically modified. A lot of our agriculture now is genetically modified. It's good when you have to feed a lot of people, but it's really, really bad if there's a change in what? What's one really big change that you can imagine would wreak havoc on genetically similar species? Yeah, environment. And what's happening currently? What's the big change that's happening currently? Global warming, right? So that's a problem. That's a problem. These animals will not be able to survive on their own. These right here. 43% of all the breeds of livestock we had at 1900 are now gone. Okay, we used to have 200 breeds of domesticated animals. 80% of these are facing extinction. So the world, what we do as a human civilization, as a human culture, what we've done is we've taken old seeds that were genetically very different from the genetically modified crops that we use today, and they store them in these seed vaults. In like places like Antarctica and Norway, places that are not going to change. They're going to stand the test of time against global warming. And in your book there's like a picture of the different shelters, and so we'll get to look at that. But I think it's spelled. It has like a weird spelling because it's Nordic, so they spell everything like Florida. They spell everything really weird. It's like Svalbard or something like that. Svalbard seed vault. So Svalbard seed vault. Mm-hmm. So yeah, they put all these genetically diverse seeds there so that in case the weather changes for the worse, we have seeds that can survive in different climates again. Because right now our seeds don't. Hey, they won't. All right. So the IUCN, the International Union of Conservation of Nature, defines and tries to figure out a point value system for for the species diversity and how threatened they are. And these are the three terms that they use. They use least concerned, near, and threatened species. Near, threatened, and threatened species. So these go in order from least concern to a little bit more concern to the most concern. And what we call this in America right here, this threatened species, we just call this endangered. Yep. Endangered. Okay, so you need to know that. We're talking about like our wildlife associations in the United States, we call that endangered. And it's a continuum, okay? It's a continuum. It is kind of tough. It's kind of tough, like defining these things, because animals that might be threatened in one geographic part of the world might be plentiful in another. So that's been the point of some controversy in the past years. And the really popular example of this is like the spotted owl. Spotted owls' numbers dwindled really, really, really low. And so they put in place legislation for like these spotted owls protecting their habitat. And people were like, but I live by killing their habitat, so I make money off that. And so you kind of have to, we got to learn some stuff in this chapter to kind of convince people why we should care, right? Okay, so let's look at this chart real quick. I want to show you a couple of these. These are pretty interesting. So this is a breakdown of how threatened amphibians, mammals, and birds are. So look real quick, amphibians have 41%. Mammals, a quarter of them are threatened. Birds, 13% threatened. So I want you to think right now, why do you think the breakdown is this way? Where you have amphibians have the largest percentage threatened, and birds are the least percent threatened. Why do you think?
Birds can fly.
Birds can fly. Birds can fly. Well, can mammals fly? Bats can. But in general, they're a little bit more mobile than amphibians are, right? If you're a fish or a frog or a turtle and you rely on water as like the medium that you live in, you really don't have a lot of options, right? Unless you put on like some sort of suit filled with water and you can come out of the water. If you're at that point as a fish, you've probably solved a lot more problems than runoff and stuff like that, right? So think about it like this: birds are able to fly away. And that doesn't mean they're in the clear just because they can fly away, okay? Because imagine if I have a wild Carlos and a wild Richard, and they like to lay eggs in the middle of a forest, just like where they're at right now. They lay eggs right there. Okay, cool. I got Alex and Ramiro here. They like to eat eggs, but they only live on the edge of where the forest and the plains meet. So they're safe. These guys are safe. Richard and Carlos are safe, right? But now, if I destroy the habitat, bam, 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 and now all I have left are these little seats right here. They don't like that. Guess where they have to go? They fly somewhere else, and maybe they go somewhere that only has like 4 seats. So now they're sitting right here where Albert would be, and now I have a wild Ramiro and Alex that are in very close proximity to those guys. So now guess what's going to happen? Now they have a new habitat that's fine, but now they're competing. They're going to be competing, right? Their lifestyles, their roles and niches are at odds with each other. Okay, so do you see that? So just because you can move doesn't mean everything's honky-dory, okay? Mammals, generally speaking, we're mammals, right? When we move around and destroy stuff, we try to make it kind of habitable for mammalian likenesses, right? So things like rats aren't going to be too affected, and they can move a little bit more. But look at amphibians. Whenever we throw stuff in the trash, what eventually happens to any liquids that are in the trash? Seeps, leaks out of the landfills. You get that leachate, right? We throw stuff down the drain. Where does it go? Before it gets to a water treatment facility, it probably goes. Some of it probably gets out somewhere, right? So these amphibians and aquatic creatures in aquatic biomes are getting the short end of the stick here. Okay, aquatic biomes are getting messed up in every single way possible, from our runoff from fertilizer, from agriculture, runoff from animal feedlots, animal poop, things like that. Plus, imagine this: if I mess up the air, I don't literally have to like be covered and saturated in air all the time, right? If I'm a mammal or a bird. The amphibians, though, that's where they breathe. They breathe, they drink, they eat out of the water. So they're in that solution all the time of whatever crap you put in there. So does that kind of make this make a little bit more sense, like why the breakdown's like this? Remember, aquatic environments, aquatic biomes are the most at danger, the most danger for all these changes that are happening. All right. So when you're trying to make the argument for why we should protect biodiversity, the 2 arguments you can make are either intrinsic or instrumental. Okay, intrinsic just means we should save it for the sake of saving it. We don't need a reason. Nature is important because it's important. Human beings are the protectors of the environment, okay? It's like kind of the hippie answer. We have a moralistic imperative to take care of things around us. Dogs are loyal, right? Super loyal. If dogs had opposable thumbs and a little bit higher order thinking, they would take care of the environment better than we could. But they can't. They don't have thumbs. Okay? So we have to have thumbs for them. That's what happens. Okay, but if you're talking to somebody who runs a coal mining plant or a logging company, and he tells you, well, I don't care about any of that stuff. Well, let the dogs have a go at it. See how well they do. Well, you have to make an instrumental value argument. Okay, and that talks about like the economics and the long-term losses and gains. You have to make kind of like a pros and cons list of those things, right? So let's talk about when you get into instrumental value, you're talking about ecosystem services. When you talk about instrumental value of biodiversity, you're talking about ecosystem services, which are provisions, regulating services, support systems, resilience, and cultural services. Provisions you know about. That was the whole point of your hotspot card. Okay, so let's break down to that. Provision is anything that humans can use as a good. That's going to be your lumber, food, crops, medicinal plants, natural rubber as opposed to petroleum-based rubber, and furs. Of 150 prescription drugs sold in the world, those top ones, 70% of them come from natural resources. Like leukemia, like one of the treatment cures for leukemia comes from a very rare remote flower in the Amazon called the rose periwinkle. Rose periwinkle. So that stuff, if you lose that ecosystem, you lose that biodiversity, all those supporting things in that ecosystem, then you end up losing something that benefits humans, right? So this is an instrumental argument right here. Regulating services, they're exactly what they sound like. They help regulate processes in the ecosystem. What are some of the cycles we know about that we've learned about this year? Give me a cycle. What's the cycle that we've learned about this year?
Carbon cycle.
Carbon cycle, boom. Yeah, the ecosystem regulates that. Here's how. Oceans, rainforests, they remove carbon from the atmosphere. What part of the ocean have we studied that is an important carbon sink? Coral, right? Coral. Coral, what about, how do rainforests help be carbon sinks?
Trees.
Yeah. Just trees, right? They remove carbon from the air. The ocean itself, the water, helps dissolve CO2 into it as well, right? You'll also learn about the hydrologic cycle, right? Nutrient cycles, taking ammonia, turning it back into nitrogen back in the air and back and forth. All that stuff is important. And now look at your eco columns. Some of these are crappy eco columns, right? They smell. You take the top off of it and you put it right back on. Yes, Ben, I fed it. Sure. Yeah, why? Because there's a lot of nitrogenous waste in there. Yeah, there's a lot of nitrogenous waste, and that nitrogen, that urea, smells like crap, smells like pee. Okay? If you don't have plants in there to take that stuff out, guess what ends up happening? You have an uninhabitable ecosystem. So that's why this stuff's important. This is an instrumental argument. Okay, let's get into support services. Support services are jobs that the ecosystem does so that we don't have to do them. Jobs that the ecosystem can do so that we don't have to pay money to do them. A couple examples of that. What's the example they have up on the screen there?
Pest control.
Pest control, right? So instead of having to put pesticides out, what's the negative effect of using pesticides? Runoff, that's right. Why do that when you can use biological control measures? What is a good biological control measure for insects? Say again?
Crop rotation?
No, not crop rotation. Talking about pest control. We're getting rid of pests. Instead of using pesticides, what can we use? What's a natural thing that gets rid of bugs? Spiders. What else? Birds, bats, right? There are lots of bats that can eat up to 3 times their own weight. And bugs every night. Those like little larks. Remember the ones that Lynn was talking about at the water treatment place? They built those little like boxes for those little birds or whatever, they eat 3 times up their own weight in mosquitoes. So that's a service that the ecosystem is doing for us that we don't have to pay for. Imagine if you had to pay for all that. Pollinating out there like an idiot, just like pollinating each flower like that with like a Q-tip. Take you years. You want to pay for that? I don't want to pay for that. The ecosystem does it for free already. You just got to take care of it. Okay, here's another one. The Everglades acts as a buffer zone. It acts as primary and secondary treatment for water. It filters out the big crap from being able to get out to the ocean, and also the soil and stuff like that. It does biological processes and breaks stuff down for you. It's awesome. Okay, resilience. Resilience, resilience, resilience. Every time you see the word resilience, I want you to associate this word to it. Biodiversity. This is all about biodiversity, but probably one of the biggest ones they're going to want you to associate is resilience is related to biodiversity. If I have Richard Reyna and Larry, both of these guys can lift 200 pounds over their head without even blinking an eye. And then a meteor comes down and smashes Larry. Am I okay? I still have one person that can lift that 200 pounds for me, right?
Yeah.
But what if I had only had Larry? Now I'm screwed, right? I got nobody to help perform that role or that niche in that ecosystem. Okay? So having a lot of biodiversity means that there are a lot of role players. There are a lot of people that can perform the same niches. They occupy the same niche. They have the same role in that ecosystem. The one they give you here is nitrogen fixation. So if you look over at your eco columns, there's some of them that look like crap, and it's because you only had like maybe one type of plant in the aquatic chamber. You had maybe one sprig of Elodea when we started, and that was it. So then the nitrogen got out of hand, and then everything went to crap, or pee, right?
Yeah.
But the people that filled their stuff up with Elodea, and they put hornwort later, and some people even had a moss rock, like their water is clean, you can lift it up, and it's just like going to like a nice fresh pond or a river or something, where you really don't smell it. Because there are a lot of things in there that even if one thing dies, the other things are able to perform that exact same task, right? Nitrogen fixation. Okay? Cultural services, this is the hippie one here. I make money off tourism because it's beautiful. It's pretty. When I look into nature, I see all the things that human beings can become and what we should be. You smell that? That's nature, right? That's what we're talking about here for cultural services. So you pay for that tourism and stuff, okay? But also, by looking at it and being inspired, you maybe want to become a scientist one day and do research. Maybe you'll discover something about nature that you can use for industry or to promote human health. So all of that in itself is a tool, right? It's a tool. And finally, there is this organization. It's a really corny name. It's not very imaginative. It's called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Sounds really cool, but it's not. I'm going to abbreviate that, but I'm not going to abbreviate assessment for obvious reasons. Yeah. So the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, they looked at like 24 different functions, and they found that 15 are declining. They also did like a little survey of trends from 20 years ago. And they were like, oh man, habitat destruction is going crazy in 1992. They're like, human footprints out of control, radical. Like they were looking at all these things that were wrong, and then they reassessed it in 2010, and guess what happened to all of those trends? Think they got better or worse? They're all worse. Every single one of them is worse. Mm-hmm. Habitat destruction is worse. Human footprints increased. The resiliency of different ecosystems has gone way down, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so this is the first half of the chapter. We'll do the second half probably tomorrow. Good.